Welcome today. My name is Tori Kaufmann-Paulman. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a member of the Pride in Our Workplace Board of Directors. I'll be hosting today's panel. Just as a reminder, PIOW's mission is to provide all LGBTQIA+ professionals with ways to amplify their voices and create a thriving workplace cultures. Helping us achieve this important work would not be possible without our amazing sponsors, Biogen, Kogo Labs, Fidelity Investments, Harbor Vest, Harvard Pilgrim, Lock Lord, Loomis Sales, State Street, Tufts Plan, and hopefully you someday. Rarely has there been a more important time to center the conversation on inclusion of transgendered employees. And I am so extremely humbled to be here with some amazing panelists and professionals to kick off our two-part series on trans inclusion in the workplace. Throughout today's session, we encourage you to ask questions by leveraging the Q&A feature that is in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Today's panel is going to provide you with the opportunity to learn from lived experience and storytelling by hearing the stories of our amazing trans panelists. As with any gender, transgender is a personal identity negotiated within a world of others with whom we must live. First panelist for today is Sheryl Cayton, she, her. Sheryl is the Vice President of Resource Development and Donor Engagement at Fenway Health. That's a mouthful, Sheryl. And she also serves on the Board of Directors for Pride in Our Workplace alongside John, who's also here with us today. We also have Trevor Bolyston, he, him. Trevor is the Global Sourcing Specialist at Boston Scientific and serves on the Board of Directors of Fenway Health. Ryan Rasdall, he, him. Ryan is a corporate attorney at Goulston Stores and serves on the Board of Directors for the National Trans Bar Association. Now, before we start today, I would like to pass the floor to Sheryl to kind of ground us down in the current reality for our trans family members.
Thanks so much, Tori. There we go. So it is a world full of change, and clearly in the past handful of years, there's been lots of wonderful things and lots of forward motion for the trans community in particular. And so that slide that you're looking at right now sort of points out how corporate America has started to make some really great gains in their understanding of trans and gender diverse people as they start to implement some policies around how to help support their trans employees. However, we also know that trans folks have enormous struggles that they have to deal with. Trans Americans tend to be about 3% higher unemployment rate, and that's even higher for trans people of color. And then the idea of 71% of transgender workers hiding their transition at work really means those folks who can and are stealth, generally speaking, because those trans folks who remain closeted so they can keep their job and so they can keep their job and keep their life moving forward, those folks don't show up in these types of research surveys. So they're hiding a huge part of their selves at work. Now, when you come out at work and you're dealing with interacting with people, obviously your company might have policies and may help your transition or help your gender identity, but then there's all sorts of practical implications of that. And this study really shows how trans people deal with or are dealt with in their work environment. Those practices often override the policies. If the policy is, yeah, of course you can have your job, but you might get harassed. 50% of folks get harassed, and 41% are just asked inappropriate questions, which is really a form of harassment or just completely awkwardness, and missing out on promotions. All of those types of practical implications of transitioning in the workplace are add extra weight to the trans person. And then, of course, this stat below of 27% of Americans wouldn't be friends with a trans person. You can feel that in your day-to-day life when you identify as trans, and it's nothing that you can, put aside. It is just, you wear it on your sleeve, so to speak, or on your face every day. In this day and age, again, we've made some wonderful strides nationally for LGBT rights, and certainly in Massachusetts. However, if you open up the news at all and you're sensitive to the transgender experience, you know that in this day and age, there are an enormous amount of anti-transgender laws that are on the books, that are up for debate and potentially getting passed in all sorts of different states. 117 in total. Most of those are geared towards trans youth, particularly around trans youth in sports and trans youth in their medical coverage and their medical care as it relates to hormone blockers, and their rights for their parents and them to make those decisions, them in particular, but their parents as well. 50 of those bills, 50 of those 117 are exclusively targeting trans people. Other times the trans community is wrapped into greater bills. And then 8 of those bills are right here in New England, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Maine. Massachusetts has none on the books right now and has generally sort of sorted this out. So thanks to all of our predecessors in Massachusetts who have helped to make this such an inclusive state. I mentioned before about the policies and the practices, and that's stuff we'll talk about a little bit today. And so the policy of a company might say, we're supportive of trans people and it's totally okay if you want to transition on the job and all of those things. But ultimately, those practices really create an enormous amount of mental health concerns and stress. They really form abuse and harassment, neglect. Those types of things really negatively impact the health and the emotional well-being of trans people at work and, of course, out in their day-to-day life as well. And then, of course, all of that emotional stress that comes from a lack of acceptance and a lack of inclusion, that boils over to violence in the trans community. And sometimes that violence boils over to murder. And we all are aware of how that happens in our day-to-day lives. These are horrible statistics, and these acts of violence are on the rise incredibly over the last handful of years. This year, we are already tragically on pace to have there will be more murders this year if we keep up this violence this year than last year, and last year was a record. It is very distressing. And so we say their names. This year, just in the past few weeks, there have been 4 or 5 murders and 1 here in Massachusetts. And take a moment to just pause. I'm not going to say their names out loud, but I do ask everybody to read these names. A moment in particular for Jahara, who passed away on May 3rd, was murdered on May 3rd. Her ceremony is this coming Saturday. And we certainly encourage anybody to provide support for the Transgender Emergency Fund, Trans Resistance, or to Jahara personally, her family. There's a GoFundMe page. Okay. I'm going to hand it back to Tori.
Cheryl, thank you so much for taking us through that. It's heavy baggage to carry, and that's really kind of where we want to start today. I've been in conversations within the board around recruiting of trans professionals. I've been in conversations around seeking out trans professionals who can tell their story, and oftentimes we're going, I'm struggling to find the, names of these people that we know are in our communities, right? People would struggle to say they know a trans executive, and yet we all know that there are plenty of trans people in executive positions and within all ranks, but not out in the workplace, which we totally embrace and accept. Yet, each of you on this panel, myself included, have chosen to share your authentic self. I know we're going to get a little into authentic self later, but you've chosen to do that. I'd like to just hear from every panelist. We're going to start with Trevor, and then Sheryl, and then Ryan, and just hear, tell us why you decided to share your story with us today. So we'll start with Trevor.
Oh, thank you, Tori. And I'm going to start by recognizing that I'm a straight white man, and when I walk into a room, no one questions my identity. They assume I am a straight white man. In reality, I am a transgender man. Yes, white. Yes, I identify as straight, but there's that piece that people don't see unless I choose to share that. And for a long time, I didn't think I would ever want to share it or need to share it. And when I started working at my current organization, I knew their supportive policies for LGBT folks. I knew their benefits were supportive. I knew they had all the right stuff on paper, and that was great. But I still didn't feel like I needed to share it until they moved my cube, and I was sitting next to a coworker who started telling transgender jokes. It was right around the time that Caitlyn Jenner had come out, and he was just sitting in his cube, shouting these jokes out for the entire section to hear. And his manager sat one cube away from him, and she said nothing. My manager was sitting a cube away from me, and she didn't know, but she's still a manager, and she said nothing. There are supervisors and directors and other colleagues around, and they're not saying anything, and it's making me angry. And I'm losing productivity because I'm angry, and I can't focus on my work because all I hear are these idiotic jokes. And I sat there, and it dawned on me after several days that I knew what the policies were. I knew what we had on paper, and it was time for me to test it. Rather than going to HR, I called this coworker into a conference room, and I said, "Hey, what's up? Why are you telling these jokes? You have no idea who around you might be trans or might have family that's trans, and what these jokes are doing to them." And he broke down crying. He said, "I have a family member who's transitioning, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know how to process it." So in that moment, I made the decision to come out to him, and I made the decision to come out to the company, because if he's going through this, then there are other people that are going through it too. So I let him ask me any questions that he wanted to ask, and really we sat in that conference room for almost 2 hours, and he just talked and asked questions. And he went from being someone that didn't have any problem telling inappropriate trans jokes to being one of the strongest allies that I have in the company. And that really catapulted me to seeing if I could help change one person and help his family member, then there were probably other people out there that I could help too. So I also find that being the straight white man, I was accepted into other spaces where I could make a difference, and that's proven out a couple of times where I work currently. And I've really I've tried to leverage the platform the best I can to make a good environment for my trans family.
Well, thank you so much. And again, you're thinking about carrying that burden, that Sheryl was talking about also in taking us through that. So with that said, let's move to Sheryl, and same question to you, Sheryl. You have a really provocative story. Can you tell us more about why you've decided not only to share your story with us, but with, the world at
Thanks.
this point?
Yeah, I don't know that my audience is big enough to call it the world, but certainly everybody here.
Our world.
Our world, absolutely right. So I worked for an organization that for years and years had very proactive anti-LGBT policies and was blatantly discriminatory. And so I worked there and worked hard to help them work their way on their journey, get on their journey. And so the idea of an organization that says, yeah, we're not going to have any LGBT staff, period, and we're not going to have anybody, we're not going to serve LGBT folks, it's kind of crazy. But that's where they were for a long time. And in doing that, obviously, those jokes that Trevor is talking about, people felt emboldened to make those kind of jokes on a regular basis, and they just felt like that was, not a part of their world. They didn't realize that there were folks in and around them all the time who are LGBT or trans in particular. And while ultimately their journey has progressed and they are much more inclusive, and I'm really proud to be a part of that, ultimately the cultural stuff was so pervasive that it became something that when I realized I was ready to transition, I didn't want to, and I'm in a position of leadership, and part of leadership is making tough decisions. And I really felt like while the organization is welcoming on paper, from a practical standpoint, there's so much cultural work to do there because they were on the wrong side of that for such a long time, that the weight of that and the weight of that in a leadership position was really going to create this very vulnerable place for me where I was going to transition and make tough decisions, exercise my leadership, which is tough enough as it is. And the residual of all of those negative feelings were all going to percolate up. And so that really caused me to say it's time to go. And I'm super glad to be at Fenway. I get to take all the skills and talents that I had in that job and really exercise them in a community, in a workplace that welcomes me completely. And I get to do that work for our community. So there's more there, and there you go. But that's my story.
That's the jackpot. No, it's not the lottery because that's a chance, but definitely, what an amazing place to land. And then Ryan, just pivoting to you around your experience. And one thing I meant to say is that we've got some really great periods in career on this panel, and I know as an early career individual, tell us more about your experience and why you're sharing both your trans identity and also all your brilliance with us today.
Thanks, Tori. So in terms of why I chose to perhaps be out as trans, and I have to back up a little bit because I transitioned while I was working at Lambda Legal, which is a huge national LGBT and HIV rights nonprofit. And so it was more of a, I would say, safe space for me to embark on that journey. However, once I applied to law school and was now in what would be considered a more professional space, it was something I had to think about. I was like, how out do I want to be? And for me, it came down to a question of safety and also a question of like my own mental health, of like how much of a burden did I want to take on? And I definitely wanted to be somewhere and work somewhere, both a law school and a firm, where me being out wasn't going to be an issue. And I didn't want to have to think about something else on top of already trying to be a lawyer, already being in law school, already being a lawyer. It didn't want something else to be, and I can't take it away. Like I already, see the world through a trans lens and through walking through this country as a Black person, but I didn't want an added burden of I have to hide who I am on top of that and navigate what that was going to be like. So for me, it was important to be out for my own self, but then as well as I think, visibility matters. And so if I can make it a little bit easier for the next trans person, for the next trans attorney of color who is trying to be in big law, then I wanted to, be a person who can help, show that you can do this and it's possible. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I love that so much. And one thing that I feel like I heard, Trevor start and then everyone touch on is this superpower of feeling safe. So, Trevor took the risk of not feeling safe to be able to interact with this colleague and then created safety for him and ultimately changed the environment that you were in. But one thing, Trevor and Sheryl, you both talked a little bit about is using privilege, using your privilege that you have to make it better for someone else who has less of that. I wonder if either one of you would jump in and speak a little bit more to that. Like, what does that look like to use that the privilege that you do carry?
Charlie, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll go first. Well, I definitely feel very, very privileged in my ability to go from one position to another right during my transition. I mean, that really super, super lucky. And talk about how grateful I am to be at Fenway. And then I transitioned very publicly in my previous organization, which is the Boy Scouts, by the way. I transitioned very publicly there so that other folks and other kids who are trans, who are in that program, or other staff members who are in that program can say, they have the policies and the practices are on the way, and they can say, okay, so Sheryl, like Sheryl was an advocate for us for all of these years, and she really helped us in these ways. It's just her time to go, but there's a safer place for all of us. I know hundreds and hundreds of trans kids and their parents who reached out to me as I exited, and I was the first transgender scout executive, executive director for the Boy Scouts ever, at least out for 30 days. So that was kind of fun. And it was really a really heartwarming thing to have all those parents and all those kids say, thanks so much. You've really, padded the drop zone for us. We have an easier way now because you really, help the organization say boldly, it is good, it is okay to be trans in the organization, even though they had said it on paper. Now it's there and out in front.
Thanks, Sheryl. That's great. Yeah, I love that too. For
anything
me
to add additionally on that?
Yeah. So when I came out at my current organization, I was a bit of a curiosity. We didn't have any out people, so I came out actually during a PFLAG event where several of our senior leaders were present, and that senior leaders are curious. They will ask you questions. They want to know. They want to engage. And if you're open to that, it creates a really powerful platform. So taking from what I've learned from the wonderful organization of Speak Out, where stories change hearts and the mind will follow the heart, having a lot of the one-on-one conversations with the senior leaders of the company opened them to the possibility of change, so that when we went to them with the benefits policy and said, your benefits for reproductive access are not equal for LGBT people, they looked at it and said, oh, okay, yes, I understand why that's important. Let's look into this. Let's make a change. So it's really, it's really having, I think I had to reach a certain point in my career to recognize what that privilege could do. And I don't think I would have had the power to do that. I don't think I would have had the understanding of what privilege truly was younger, in earlier in my career. But now it becomes more apparent every day. And especially in the wake of everything that's happened in the country over the past year, seeing the disparate segments of people who are struggling, and just further from the center of privilege, that it's made it even more important that I can help make a safe space for some of us.
I love that. And I have a follow-up for you, Ryan, but there was something that we talked about, Trevor, when we were planning around this, was you shared a little bit about the career and the jobs that you had during your transition. And I think that's really, if you're willing to talk a little bit about that experience, it was so unique and such I mean, frankly, if someone is on this session and thinking like, how can I possibly be my authentic self? It's a creative idea. Would you share more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I transitioned, I was so uncomfortable in my own skin that I couldn't settle into anything. I worked a ton of different jobs, and what that created was a resume that was kind of all over the place. it was a mess to explain for a while there. Once I transitioned, and I transitioned coming out of an abusive relationship where I had been cut off from my own source of income. So when I started my transition coming out of that relationship, I needed to get back into a corporate role, but wasn't quite sure how to go about that. So I ended up temping, and I would say it was one of the best things for me at the time. It let me get back into a corporate role, but it also let me transition in short-term spaces where I didn't have to deal with the questions when my voice changed and the shape of my face and my beard started coming in and my hair started to go away. I was able to spend 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, 2 weeks at another place. And once about a year into my transition, when I was really sure of myself, I landed at a corporation in Cambridge, and it was supposed to be a 4-day assignment. I ended up there for 8 years before moving on to my current role. But having that space to try kind of different nicknames with coworkers and different personality of what's going to fit for me, who am I now, and who am I going to be, was really just such a great experience for me early in my transition.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I think it should go into the playbook. I think there's something that ties back to the safety, which is we should be safe. We should feel safe to come to work and be like, hey, I want to go by Nick now, and have people like go right on, right? That should be the world that we live in, but it isn't, and in many cases it isn't. So I just found it so charming and such a positive experience. Now, pivoting to Ryan for another experience that was challenging that you then turned into something else. You shared a little bit about why you chose law and how and when that occurred. And it reminds me a little bit of what we're experiencing now that Sheryl shared about in terms of the bills that are circulating through states seeking to harm trans youth, seeking to restrict their access to things like sports, which is terrible, but also their access to gender affirming medical care, which is horrifying. And it reminded me of what you took out of a similar experience. Would you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when I started working at Lambda Legal, I came in, I believe it was October 2012. So at the time, there was no, nationalized gay marriage. And I believe my first day, actually, New Jersey had just passed gay marriage. And so about a year later, when the decision came down, soon afterwards, there were, just like you were saying, just like today, there were a flurry of bills that were targeting trans people, whether it was access to bathrooms, access to medical care. A lot of states and a lot of companies were not offering coverage for healthcare. And so there was a huge fight that was happening. And so there, at the time, I was thinking about law school, and I was working closely with the attorneys at Lambda Legal, who were amazing litigators. And I just saw up close, the pain that, was happening for trans people and the hard work that the attorneys were putting in. And I was thinking to myself, well, I don't see myself reflected. I want to be a trans attorney, but I was first generation, just, got out of college a few years before. And B, I didn't see any other trans people of color in an attorney role. And so, and I later did discover some, they were out there, and they're at some of the, other amazing LGBT-focused queer nonprofits. So I decided to apply to law school with that focus in mind of how do I better the community? How do I add to the story and also, help fight these terrible bills and terrible things that are going out there now? Granted, I am at a law firm now, but between the work that I did on campus, between the various nonprofits that I sit on the board of, I am still advocating for trans people, especially trans people of color, who are often left out of the conversation.
Well, thank you for that. And also, I hope that is inspiring, people on this call or people who may have children on this call, to take this as an opportunity, what we're seeing. So pivoting from that into, as a trans person who chooses to come out, both Sheryl and Trevor have both shared this. You then sometimes are put in a position as being the expert. And Sheryl has said many times, I can speak for me, but I don't speak for all, women and trans women out there. you both have had to navigate this a little bit around policy education. You talked to policy versus practice a little bit. Let's start with Trevor. You shared that story, but I think there are other things that you've shared in our prep around what you've had to do and the burden there.
Yes, and it's important if you have someone come out in your workspace not to make them the sole educator. There's a lot you can do to educate yourself. Google is a wonderful tool. If you need some resources, we can point you into some reputable websites. But I've chosen to take on that educator role, and especially in environments like this, it is exhausting. It is mentally draining. And as I've built with my colleagues an environment where more people are coming out and feel safe to be non-binary in the workplace, feel safe to be trans in the workplace, they are also being asked to be educators, and they are hearing stories and sharing stories back about parents with trans kids who feel suicidal, or doctors in cases making trans jokes, and it gets reported to them because they're the only resource that the reporter knows who may understand what's happening. And I saw a question come into the chat about how do you stop this from being damaging to your own mental health. You have to find a way to ground it. I have to find a way to compartmentalize and understand my company policies of who should this be reported to. We do have an advice line. We do have an employee assistance program that we can call. And recently, several of us that have bared the larger burden for this have asked our DE&I team to see if we can get a group moderated counseling session to talk about how to let go of this when it's not our burden to carry. But it's not easy, and some of them hit you harder than others, and some of them you just want to help. I never want to tell someone no when they ask questions, because I don't want them to turn away or assume that they're closed off from our community. I want them to be able to come and ask the questions. But there are sometimes I would like to just say, not today, I'm tired. But I don't want to close off that communication for them. So I will always make time for someone that comes to me with questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sheryl, we know you also had to do this and also made some choices around how much of it you were willing to do. And for you, like Trevor's saying, like, where is the boundary of self-care and making it better for yourself and for others? What has been your experience in this transition, and I mean the career transition in that case?
Yeah, I would say for me, I'm lucky in that the line that I often say is I represent, but I am not representative. Like, so in a conversation like this, we are representing the trans community, but we are not representative of all the experiences that trans people have in the workplace. I think that's part of the privilege thing that I usually say. And I say that when people start asking me questions all the time, like, yeah, sure, I'm happy to answer, but ultimately I'm going to speak from my lived experience, right? For me, my own self-care around that stuff, I'm very happy to talk about my own experiences. And because of my volunteer work in the trans community, I felt more prepared. I wasn't dealing with my own transition in a vacuum, like, oh my gosh, how does this work? I've been volunteering in the trans community for 20 years. I have so many friends that have transitioned and all of that stuff that I was like, okay, I have a little bit of personal extra bandwidth. So I'm happy to share that bandwidth with folks who are sincerely trying to learn and that are already close to me, or folks that I feel connected to. So I put some barriers around it, and that's one of them. Like, if we're close, of course I'm happy to share my stuff. If we're not close, I just tell people right away, like, yeah, these are things that you have to look up on your own. You don't start a conversation with someone who you're like, I kind of know you from afar. By the way, can I talk to you about your medications or whatever the heck it is? It's crazy. And I just put that out there. So I gave those guardrails to others. And then I had this 30-day window where I was leaving one job and starting another. And I was clearly very gender fluid in that 30 days. And then I said, on the other side of this 30 days, this is how it works. And that was a guideline for me that said, I'm happy to share my story, very openly at that point. And then on the other side of it, it's Sheryl all the time. This is how it works. And away we go.
I love that. I love that you created space, and Ryan and Trevor, you both talked about this. You said this is the playground in which you may engage with me in these ways. And I think it's probably hard sometimes to set those boundaries. And then at this period of time, in your case, or at this boundary of topic in this case, that's the end of it, and you got to go do your homework. So that's really great. Now, one of the things, and bring your authentic self to work, is something that I am trying really hard not to say, because I think it is tricky, and I think it's a buzzword, and I think many people, Sheryl and I have talked a bit about, like, bring your authentic self to work. If you're cisnormative and white, do it, right? But otherwise it's challenging. So can I ask each of you, what has your experience been around bringing your authentic self to work, and have you experienced challenges? Have you experienced microaggressions? Have you experienced moments where you feel like you are still code shifting a little bit? And Ryan, we haven't heard from you in a little while, so would it be okay if I started with you?
Sure. So I think I was thinking about this question, and the thing that kept popping in my head was, I'm constantly doing a filter. I'm constantly like, how much do I share? How much do I share about myself or about my past? So if, like, we're talking about, just in casual conversations with coworkers, if we're talking about our childhoods, or if we're talking about college, like, for me, it's a different story. I didn't identify as male then. I may have experienced things very differently from my male identified colleagues. And so it's always something that I have to think about. And so I don't always have an answer. I don't know how authentic people, I think it's just, like I said, it's a safety thing. It depends on how much you want to share, and it depends on who you're interacting with. How safe do you feel? How comfortable do you feel? Do we have a friendship outside of work? Do we talk about other things? And something I was thinking about in relationship to this question was having, cis people think about how vulnerable do you feel like you have to be as well. So in order for us to have those conversations, it requires some level of being uncomfortable. And I always say, like, as a Black trans person, I'm pretty much uncomfortable almost all the time. I live in a world that doesn't, constantly affirm who I am, and doesn't want to see, my community thrive. And so having those conversations with me, of course I have to feel comfortable enough to have them. I usually am, but it requires vulnerability from both folks. So I think the authentic, how authentic we can be at work, it really depends person to person. I'm grateful and thankful that I'm at a firm where I haven't felt the microaggressions, or I haven't had any negative experiences. I know that's not the case across the board. I know that there are lots of trans attorneys who are struggling at firms and are not thriving as much as they should be. And so I think that really requires leadership and individuals to do the work and to do the hard work. And I think that starts with, like I was saying, being uncomfortable and having some uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you so much. And actually, Trevor, same question, and feel free to offer anything else, but something that Ryan said reminded me of something that you said earlier around your experience with coming out to this colleague. It sounded positive. And what was the other impact of that on you? Was there, what you were being helpful, but how was that for you in terms of having to come out in order to change that experience?
Well, after the adrenaline rush settled and I realized there wasn't going to be any major fallout, it was so freeing. All of a sudden, I didn't have to devote all this energy to hiding that part of my identity. And it wasn't, on the surface, it doesn't look like it's hard to hide that, but changing in the locker room, or going to CrossFit with the other male coworkers, or any of the typical guy stuff, which I was always a little awkward around. It was a little bit easier now. I felt like there was like, oh, okay, we get it. It's an interesting space, and
Yeah.
funny. He told me recently. I've been there for 6 years. This happened about 6 years ago. He told me recently he spent the next 3 weeks terrified that HR was coming to walk him out any day because he thought I'd gone to HR to report it. For me, it was just freeing. It was like, all right, they do have it on paper, and I can leverage those policies and our code of conduct, and things are okay. And just being able to get to that, all right, I can be who I am. I don't have to hide this. I don't have to, if someone asks me where I learned to play hockey, I can say the South Shore Women's Hockey League. I don't have to make up some story about some men's league somewhere where I was, living in another state. You didn't have to worry anymore about who knew and who didn't know, and it's very freeing. But again, I'm safe to be out like that in my office.
I love that. And I saw the emotional response that Cheryl just had, and felt it in that same moment, the ability to talk about your childhood, to talk about, to not hide things, and how Ryan was saying, it requires vulnerability on both sides, and it can't be just one-sided. It has to come from both folks feeling vulnerable and then safe. And Cheryl, this question's slightly different, same sort of context around what was the burden and maybe joy of the boundary of during that period of time, and potentially afterwards, of people screwing it up, and then you having to, like, what has that been like?
Yeah, so again, my story, right? So I identified as bigender for decades. And I lived a very compartmentalized life, which is why I have such a strong reaction to Trevor's thing about, I'm going to tell this story authentically, right? And I would typically have 2 or 3 people in my immediate circle that I would tell, and I would say, like, oh yeah, this is, and they would get a chance to, if they were interested, to meet me as Cheryl and all that stuff. And it was that person, or those 2 or 3 people, would be my sort of small safe space where I could bring my authentic self to work. And I lived that way for 27 years. And then in the past year or 2, as I was getting ready, and I would tell more people and expanded that circle from a handful to a couple of dozen to 50 to eventually, like, okay, here's how this is going to go. I was so used to and so prepared for people to, I told them I would be gender fluid for 30 days. I was like, here's the deal. This is how, I'm not going to get worked up about, making a mistake with my name. I still have a lot of work to do, all that stuff. What really blew me away was how wonderful the individual people were that I was dealing with. I knew my board was going to be supportive, and I knew my senior staff was going to be supportive. But in those 30 days, it was amazing. People, I would present as Chuck on a video call, and they would call me Cheryl. And I was like, well, this is great. In that wonderful support, I was like, oh, I'm just going to start to come to work as Cheryl in the last couple of weeks. It was great. So people, they really were so good. I'm glad I got a chance to talk about how great that community was, even though I was so apprehensive about it. And I don't regret it for a second. It was still the right thing to do for them and for me and all that. But it's so good to know that those individual folks were super supportive, and I gave them all the latitude to make mistakes, and they hardly ever did.
Cheryl, do you think that is a secret to success? So temping, experiencing career inspiration in darkness, and providing a short period of time in which you can experiment. Do you think that that's like a secret recipe? Like creating safety, where it's like, this is the period of time you have as a, playground.
Yeah.
Go for it. What do you think about that?
I think I don't know that I am the one to sort of say it's a secret recipe. It certainly worked for me. And that's just the way that I live my life. Like, okay, I can deal with this kind of struggle or this type of ambiguity for X amount of time, but then I need to hit the ground and I got to get going. And so it made sense to me to sort of put it out that way. And people did seem to, respond to that.
Yeah. It's so great. I just keep thinking people get more defensive when they're frightened of being embarrassed or ashamed, right?
Right.
So providing an opportunity for them to screw up with you've taken on the shame away, might be it. And it kind of, sort of pivots into the next sort of section, which is what is, and I'd love to hear from everybody. So we'll start back over at the beginning again. We'll just go in the circle. But what is the role of cis, white, straight, whatever configuration of people that we are not in supporting these types of experiences, both for you? So did you have any people who were unbelievable? Did you have any people that were not so great? What can we tell our attendees about that? So Ryan, can we start with you? Like, what is the role of the ally?
I think I actually took some notes based off the question. So I think the first thing I wrote down was follow the trans person's lead. If they're saying I'm trying out different pronouns right now, or I'm trying out different clothing right now, or this is what I need at the moment, then follow their lead, because they know what's going to work for them. And that's like the best advice I can give. Don't assume that you know what they're going to need. Don't assume that you know what they're going to be doing in a year or in 6 months. Not every trans person wants to engage in medical transition. Not every trans person wants to change their name. So you just don't know. And so I would always encourage allies to follow the lead of the trans person when you're trying to figure out like how best to support them.
I love that. What do you think, Trevor?
I'd say there's no one right way to be an ally, and being an ally should be a verb. You're taking actions, and everyone on the ally journey is in a different place. For some people, just saying the words transgender and non-binary out loud for the first time is their first step to being an ally. For others, it's really staying aware of the legislation. And if you're in a place where you can vote to knock down some of this disgusting legislation that's happening, if you are in a company that has a corporate social responsibility program that is looking for that HRC 100 score and wants to take action, take action. Understand where your company can influence, where you can influence your company to have influence. It takes more than one, although it can start with one voice. And you'll find allies in the most unexpected places. Some of the roughest people I know have turned out to be some of the biggest softies and biggest allies that I've had in my life, and other people that I fully expected to be allies haven't. In one case, a medical, I went in for an exam, and the physician told me I was no longer welcome in her practice. Thank goodness for Fenway Health. I would not be getting appropriate care if it were not for Fenway Health. But that was early in my transition that I came out to that person, and it shaped a lot of who I told early on. So listen, follow the platinum rule, which is treat people as they want to be treated. Don't out people without their permission, and ask them, if someone's first coming out and they say, please use this name, but not in a big broad setting, or it's okay to use this name, but not in conference calls. Do your best. Sometimes outing someone can be dangerous. So just do your best. If you make a mistake, apologize, move on. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's not about you. It's about the trans or non-binary person that you're working with.
That's awesome. And Cheryl?
Yeah, I was so busy listening to both of those great answers. I haven't really thought my thing through. I just think that the thing about being the ally, and the thing that both the guys talked about, is don't sort of anticipate, oh yeah, I know 2 other trans people, I'm a good ally, so I know where you're gonna land, or like, whoa, do not do that. And the other thing, like, being an ally for folks who are non-conforming, right, non-cis normative, like the 3 of us, again, the 3 of us on the panel, and you might have a different experience, but we have all sort of said like, oh yeah, we're gonna present in this cis-normative gender, and it's easy for people to be allies, or easier for people to be allies for us. But you know, if your friend is gender nonconforming, and like sit with what that is to be an ally with yourself before you open your mouth, and don't say like, oh yeah, well, you would look really good if you would do, like, oh, do not do that. Let them find their own way. They'll come. I ask my cis female friends, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? How do you think I should wear this? Let me break it.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because we have had some really great questions, and I'm going to talk about most of them. You have all hit, which is just why you're here, because you're all so amazing. But one of them was around words of wisdom for supporting non-binary or gender expansive people, and on the panel, that's how I identify. So I can share a little bit about that. And then I also had a question for our panelists around who has inspired you. So I do not want to embarrass her, but I'm going to anyways. You know, I also transitioned into a different career over the last couple of weeks and had no intention at all of sharing my true authentic self or my non-binary pronouns, because in some ways my new job is client facing. I then met Sheryl and heard Cheryl's story and was so unbelievably, completely, you know, breath taken out of me at how courageous and how much she was leaning into this experience of I don't even have words. And so I did in fact choose to use this career opportunity, this career change as an opportunity to also come out. So what I would say to that answer, words of wisdom, is look for what did Mr. Rogers say? Look for the helpers, right? Look for, you know, people in your community who you can draw inspiration from, draw courage, you know, drain away a little bit of their courage and try to use it for your own. And then as an ally to people who are gender expansive and non-binary, do what Sheryl is saying, you know, like really make space. If you are, you know, cis presenting or, you know, if that's the language and pronouns that you use, try to do the educating on their behalf and try to really expand the sense of gender. But I also want to open it up to Trevor and Ryan, who may also have some great advice on being an ally to non-binary or expansive people, if you do, or people who have inspired you. So you can choose your own adventure in that question.
The person who inspired me actually helped make our company open to non-binary and transgender people. So we have an amazing colleague named Ebony Travis. She was a senior manager in the DE&I team when I started. Now she is the director of our equal opportunity employment segment, and she lives her life to her absolute fullest every single day, and she always has energy for other people. You can feel the energy change when she's on a call or she's in a room with you, and she is just, you know, she's based in Texas, and she is just absolutely the most amazing human being I've ever met in my life. And when I was starting my journey with the Pride ERG and stepping into my first leadership role with the company, Ebony was the one that was there at my back saying, you can do this, you've got this. And I would say, Ebony, how do we navigate this? How do we change this? What can we do? And she didn't always know the answer, but she always had someone in her network that was willing to step up and help. And the way she was able to build that network and really foster just this love of diversity and inclusion in everyone she comes in contact with has left a lasting impression on me.
I love that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was pivoting to you, Ryan. Please.
In terms of someone who inspires me, I'd have to mention, I would call him both a mentor and a friend at this point. Drew Lebastor, who was formerly, when I was at Lambda Legal, the national director for the Trans Rights Project, and that's kind of how I got into trans rights work. It's seeing him present at a conference, like a really small conference in Connecticut, actually, in the same town where my all-girls private boarding school was. But seeing him present that one year, and I remember breaking down and just being like, I'm trans, and it's been hard to say that out loud. It wasn't something that I wanted to I always tell people, like, I didn't want to be trans. It was really, really hard to say yes and embrace it, because just our society was just so not okay with trans people. And so he's been both my like biggest cheerleader and fan, and has always encouraged me to do, you know, things that may scare me or things that I didn't think I could do. And he was the first out trans attorney that I knew, and I think he's been my biggest inspiration to do what I do now. So that's my person.
That's awesome. Now, we had a question come in about nonprofits. Each and every single one of us on this panel serves on a nonprofit. And also we started this presentation or this panel by talking about how it can sometimes be difficult to bring to mind, you know, trans individuals who are not out. So the question, I'm just going to read it as it was written. You know, this particular person is with a nonprofit. They currently do not have any trans board members. They have in the past, and they're looking to recruit a diverse board without tokenizing members of the trans community. You all are on boards. Does anybody have any advice for Joan on this?
You don't want to tokenize any community when you're trying to recruit diverse board members. So that's the key there. You need the right people in the right positions, and you need to be recruiting in places where those people are. So for our community, look at the Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce. Look at folks who are at Fenway Health. Look at other professional organizations that have out visible trans people and recruit in those spaces. A lot of people want to help, but don't always know where to start or how to get involved.
Right. And it's like the more you're involved, like I'm sure that all of us know plenty of trans people, right? And that's like saying, oh, I don't know how to hire, I don't know, where do I go to find a good quality Black executive for this particular thing? Well, if I'm in that universe, I know tons of them. And so really what you're doing with your question is oftentimes you're saying, I'm not in that universe. And then you are susceptible to potentially tokenizing people because you're not authentically in that space, but you want them to be in your space. And so you got to go to that space. And the act of going to that space will do two things. It will minimize the amount of tokenism that you're going to inadvertently bring to that conversation. And two, you're going to find the person you're looking for. So volunteer is what I would say. If I had a board and I really wanted to climb into a particular segment of the community, I would say to my board members, hey, let's all go volunteer in this geographic community. Let's all volunteer in this trans community. Let's all go volunteer. Let's do that for a sustained amount of time. I mean, you don't have to go like every day, but you know, a few times a year, let's go volunteer in this particular place, and we're going to meet people that we want to work with.
That's great advice, Cheryl. And I can also speak from the PIOW perspective, in that we created a mapping when we were recruiting new board members, of which we're so grateful Cheryl has joined. We did identify some characteristics around BIPOC and trans identified individuals that we wanted to have on the board. We also took stock of who we were and what characteristics we brought to the board, both from a diversity and inclusion perspective, or from a diversity perspective, but also from a you know, actual professional capabilities perspective. So we, you know, one of our most senior board members created a spreadsheet, and we put all our things in. And so we were very clear. It sounds very complex, but we were very clear that we were not just after trans identified individuals or people of color. We were after these characteristics, this diversity, and it made us feel very, you know, grounded in what we were looking for. It took away that feeling, and it also it gave us the ability to explain to board members, "Hey, we're seeking you out because you have this characteristic, and this characteristic." So going through the process like that. The other questions that we've had, and Ryan, if you wanted to share anything on that.
I think everyone hit on what I was going to say, is that you need to it'd be exposing yourself to the community more, so that it definitely is not a token. So Cheryl, you hit it right on the head. So
Yeah, so you're not just like going through your Rolodex the day you need something.
absolutely.
Yeah. So we've had a fair number of questions from people who want to get started. They want to get, I'm a strong believer in the power of one idea, one thing that you can do today that can, start the ball rolling. And we've had a fair number of people say, how can I get started? I'm an ally. And just a reminder, and I think some of our panelists have said this, you don't get to say you're an ally. Other people say you're an ally about you through your actions, as Trevor has said. So I'm ready. I want to take action. What is one or two or however many things that someone could just get started with today to take action on their allyship? And I'll direct so nobody has to have the awkward pause. Trevor, can I get you to share like action?
Sure. Start watching your language. Are you using inclusive language in your email communications? If you have, if you're authorizing or authoring policies and procedures, are you using neutral language there? You notice all of us have our pronouns in our name boxes. Start adding your pronouns to your email signature. Even if you're not in the trans or non-binary population, you are setting the example that you're not going to single out anyone who has to say, I use pronouns that are not what you would consider the traditional he, him, or she, her. So start with language. It's an easy one. You can put I had a gender jar on my desk. Anyone that misgendered me, $1 in the jar. I'm kidding. I didn't really actually do that, but it would have been funny.
Could make some little money
language.
too, That's awesome. And actually one of our board members, as we prep to pivot to Ryan, one of our board members who is a straight ally, and I say about her that she's an ally. And she put in her signature, her pronouns, and to the right, she put a link to mypronouns.org, which, by the way, if you haven't been there, is an amazing resource because it has a tab for every, not every, but many of the pronoun configurations and what to do when you screw up and how to practice. So it's a fantastic resource. So not only is she signaling that she's, inclusive, but she's also signaling how to become more inclusive. So that's another way to do it. Ryan, what's one or two things that people could start doing today?
I think what I always tell people is believe trans people, just believe them. Whatever they're saying, I think I mentioned it earlier, like following their lead. The one stat that I always, whenever I've done a panel about trans issues that I've shared, is like, if you remember nothing else, it's unfortunately, it's not a happy stat, but I think the national average for lifetime suicide attempt rate is 4%, and it's 10 times that in the trans community. It's about 40% of trans people attempt suicide at some point in their life, and people don't believe who we are. People don't treat us how we identify. And so I always just tell people, just believe trans people. And I think Trevor, what you said before is also really important. Interrogate, your ideas about gender and think about, what language you're using around gender. And so I think those are some of the more important parts of it. Just really believe and support trans people.
Thank you. And Cheryl?
I would say, by the way, those are the great answers. And then if you have energy to go beyond those two great answers, I would say volunteer. And I would say volunteer by finding your trans friends and find your LGBT friends if you don't have trans friends, and start liking what they say. Follow pages that are trans related, and volunteer opportunities and places to interact with trans people are going to come up. They're there. We have very full calendars. There's a lot of things that we're doing for the community. And if you want to truly help get to know folks who are trans and volunteer and understand more deeply what is going on for the whole trans community, not just us representatives.
Right. That is amazing. I hope you all have all that energy. They don't all have to be done today. There's three, they sound if you haven't done them before, they might sound like a lot, but quite simple shifts that you can make. So I'm gonna throw it over to John Vasili, who is here somewhere, and I think he's gonna come on camera and just close out our session today. Hi, John.
Hello.
Close out our session today. Talk a little bit about what's coming next. But before I do that, I just am so unbelievably grateful to have been the flight attendant for today and to take up space with you all. It's been a true honor, and it's an honor to be on the board of PIOW. So with that, thank you all, and John, please.
Thank you, Tori. And we are very, very blessed to have you. And you are a masterful moderator.
Absolutely.
You might have just volunteered for every panel that we have for the next 2 years, but that would be fine by me. No, thank you so much for a wonderful job, Tori. And thank you to our panelists today for sharing their powerful stories and experiences. We got a lot of great information, a lot of helpful ideas for all of us. The only way we can continue to make progress is to amplify the voices of our transgender colleagues and give them an opportunity to share their stories. But as we learned from our panelists, it's also critically important to educate ourselves, take responsibility for that so that we can play that active role in creating a more inclusive workplace for our trans colleagues so that they can thrive and succeed. And I loved Trevor's comment, ally is a verb. I think I'm going to use that now. That was something that I'm definitely going to take away. That was really very strong. I want to commend Sheryl, Trevor, and Ryan for such a great job today. Thank you so much for your honesty, your integrity, your transparency, your passion, your engagement, and your commitment to this work. I also want to point out that Sheryl and Trevor and a number of other individuals are going to be continuing this work with a trans workplace inclusion steering committee, which I think is very long overdue. And we're really thrilled that Sheryl's taking the lead on this. And there'll be more information about the work that they're going to be doing in upcoming months. And I'm really thrilled that Sheryl has joined our board because she'll play a critical role in helping keep us connected to that work so that Pride in Our Workplace can continue to advocate and influence for progress in this area as well. So we're going to really keep that top of mind for our agenda moving forward. So having her spearhead this work is going to be really important for us. So finally, thank you, Sheryl. Finally, please join us for part 2 of this conversation. I'm very excited to report. We'll be on June 2nd. We are thrilled to have another masterful moderator, Colleen Simonelli, who's also on our board. We're going to have Jennifer Levy, who's the director of the Transgender Rights Project. We have Irene Brank, who is a workplace trans inclusion coach at Brank Consulting. She's also the head of leadership and performance at MassMutual. And Ellen Lapointe, who is the chief executive officer at Fenway Health. I've been a patient of Fenway Health for almost 30 years, and I can tell you they do an amazing job in trans workplace inclusion. So we're thrilled to have Ellen support us on the 2nd. So definitely join us. We're thrilled to have you back. Thanks for everybody for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you all back on June 2nd. Thanks again, and have a great day, everybody.